Today we're going to be speaking about the Harry S. Truman Torah. That's right. President Harry Truman had a Torah. And this is going to be a story about that Torah today. And it's a discussion that we had at the Dix Hills Jewish Center on Long Island. And just to explain a little bit about the history of the Torah was presented to the rabbi at the seminary, and it was presented to him by Rabbi Louis Finkelstein. He was the chancellor of the conservative movement's Jewish Theological Seminary. And the Torah actually had been owned by Ezra Finkelstein, who is the son of Rabbi Louis Finkelstein. Ezra Finkelstein is now a rabbi, and he'll be on the program too. And we'll be talking with his son, Harvey Finkelstein, and as well helping in the questioning is Seth Lipner, a member of the congregation, and the one who kind of helped organize this whole event. And we're going to start with a discussion of the Torah itself and a little bit about Harry Truman with Kurt Graham. He's director of the Harry S. Truman Library and Museum in Independence, Missouri. That's where the Torah is kept. And so Kurt is talking about the Torah and talking about President Truman's deep attachment to the Torah. Let's pick it up from that discussion.
Truman had been concerned, deeply concerned, about the fate of not just Jews in Europe, Jews in particular, of course, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, but a lot of other displaced peoples who were, for whom the Holocaust and the Nazi regime had taken such a devastating toll. Truman began making speeches about this when he was still a senator. And of course, he spoke passionately, he spoke in very high profile ways about this, and never afraid to take a risk. And this moment in the spring of 1948, and I remind you that Truman would be facing re-election in the fall of that year, he was in a real pickle because he had his own State Department against him. His inclination was to recognize the new state, to allow Jews who were basically refugees from Europe to come and settle there. It put him at odds with the British. It put him at odds with General Marshall, his Secretary of State, whom he revered. There were several people who just said, don't do it. This is political suicide. The Arabs and the oil. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons you don't want to do this. And politically, you're not gaining anything. You could be losing things. And, Truman went on later to desegregate the troops, as you know, in July of 48. And famously, in that 6-month period, as he's doing all these things, potentially alienating voters by taking these courageous stands, he said, I'd rather be right than be president. And I just so admire that and think of that so often when I see our politicians and folks today. I don't think many people would be willing to put their political careers on the altar in the way that Harry Truman did and take those kinds of risks. But Truman was in the thick of it. He was caught between his own feelings of compassion and what the right thing to do, and not just that, oh, these people have been injured, we need to try and make something right. He knew he couldn't make it right, but he also had such a deep sense of history, and he read the Old Testament prophecies and whatnot as literal history. This was not allegory for him. This was real. It was absolute real history. And so for him, when they gave him the Torah, he said, I always wanted one of these. He knew what was there, and he knew what it said and what it meant. And it meant a lot to him on a lot of levels to have that sacred scroll, that sacred book in his possession. And we'll talk a little bit more about that because he had an opportunity to give it back, and he wasn't about to do that. But anyway, he meets Weizmann at the behest of his lifelong friend Eddie Jacobson, and Eddie had been in World War I with him. They ran the commissary out at the fort before he went over to World War I, over to France to fight. And when they got back from the war, they went into business together. and they were failed businessmen. They ran a haberdashery. They sold shirts and ties, men's clothing and hats. And the 20s were a tough time, and they lost. They lost out. And so Truman did what any failed businessman did. He went into politics, and he ran for office in eastern Jackson County. He became a judge. It's a county commissioner essentially, and began the work of paving roads and doing the kinds of local things that those people do. He finally got tapped to run for the Senate, which surprised him, and he did. And he spent 10 years in the Senate, and then of course 82 days as vice president, and then gets sworn in as president. Now, at the time that Jacobson comes to him, there's a little bit of it's a mixed message here, because Truman did not want to hear anymore from the Zionists, whom Jacobson and Weitzman and others represented. He felt like he was sympathetic to the cause, he was doing his best, and he didn't need any additional pressure. But he agreed because Jacobson was a friend to meet him. And Jacobson said, he was in the Oval Office, and Truman had a portrait of Andrew Jackson. And he said, I want you to meet a man that is, to me, what Andrew Jackson is to you. He's someone who means a great deal to our people. And, the words from you, Harry, will carry so much weight. The fate of my people depends on this. And so Truman was frustrated by it. He was upset, but he finally agreed that he would meet with Weitzman.
Came time for me at the age of 13 to become a bar mitzvah. My father decided to give me a gift, and it was a unique one. I still recall the day on a Sunday when my father took me out to visit his father, my grandfather. My grandfather was a much older man, obviously, but he was also a very interesting figure in my life. He could hardly communicate with me because his language was Yiddish and my language was English. And that when I went to see him, that he always concluded the visit by giving me a particular blessing that is found in the Torah, that the blessing that priests gave to the people of Israel. The 3 verses: may the Lord bless you and keep you, may the Lord turn his face to you and be gracious to you, may the Lord lift his countenance to you and give you peace. And then he would give me a special gift, a dollar bill, which my father had given to him because my grandfather was not a rich man. And my father took me out to my grandfather's house, and that a scribe met us there. And the scribe brought with him a small scroll of the Torah. When I say small, it was about 15 inches high as compared to the normal size of a Sefer Torah, which is about 3 feet, 4 feet high. That the reason that the scribe brought the Sefer Torah there was because the Torah had not been finished. It was incomplete, and that my father wanted to have what is called a Siyum HaTorah, a completion of the Torah in my presence and in my honor on the occasion of my becoming a bar mitzvah. And so with the assemblage of my father, some of his brothers and sisters, and their children, as well as my grandfather and his second wife, that each of us had a scribe write a letter for us by holding the quill with him and having him inscribe a letter in the Torah on our behalf, which fulfilled the commandment that a Jew is supposed to write a Torah. If you write one letter in the scroll of a Torah, you have fulfilled the mission. And I still recall that how the scribe gave me a feather, a quill, and I turned it back to him, and he wrote on my behalf a letter in the scroll of the Torah that marked its completion. That having had this occasion, that I fulfilled my part in the ritual of becoming a bar mitzvah by chanting from another Torah, not that one, in the synagogue of the Jewish Theological Seminary, and in the presence of my father and my grandfather, reading from a scroll of the Torah and reciting the prophetic portion of the week. And that on a number of occasions, my father would take me to the seminary for an afternoon service on a Saturday afternoon or some other holiday, and that the scroll of the Torah would be read, because the scroll of the Torah was kept, my Torah was kept in the seminary. It was part of a collection of Sifrei Torah that belonged in the seminary. And then I was bar mitzvah in March 1940. The war in Europe had already begun, but some months later, on December 7th, 1941, America became involved in the war in Europe as well as the war in the Pacific. And a graduate of the seminary named Rabbi Harold Gordon, who was a chaplain in the U.S. services, and who flew across the Atlantic, visiting bases in Canada, in Greenland, wherever there was a military base, he would visit it, and he took with it my Sefer Torah, because it was small enough to be carried around in a small bag or handbag, and that it was clear enough, well enough written that he could use it to read for the Jewish servicemen who were in the particular bases that he visited. And after the war, that he returned it to the seminary for safekeeping. But that he would tell me about how happy he was to have a small light Sefer Torah that he could carry with him and use in giving services to the American military. My father received the phone call from a representative of the Israeli delegation to the UN, and that asking him for a gift that Chaim Weizmann could take to present to President Truman. That my father said, you know, they should have brought something from Israel, a relic from something in the past, or but that my father was not empowered to give away anything that had been given to the Jewish Museum. But he said that my son has a Sefer Torah, and I'm sure he would be happy to give it to President Weizmann, and for President Weizmann to give it to the President of the United States. That my father never asked me the question, assuming that rightly that I would follow his wishes in that respect, and that I have always had a sense of joy that something of mine that was part of the history of the relationship between the United States and the government of the State of Israel. That the day after that Chaim Weizmann visited Truman in the White House and presented him with a Sefer Torah, I was stunned to see on the front page of the New York Times the picture that's on the screen now of the two presidents and my Sefer Torah. That I received subsequently a copy of the letter that Chaim Weizmann sent to my father, thanking him for the gift that had been part of my bar mitzvah celebration.
Let me explain at this point in the discussion that I joined Rabbi Finkelstein, Seth, and Harvey, as well as Rabbi Howard Buechler and a delegation from the Dixers Jewish Center on a trip to the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia to see the Truman Torah. Now, Seth had arranged to have it shipped there from the Truman Library while the library was undergoing renovations. So the story now picks up with Rabbi Finkelstein seeing the Torah for the first time while it was still in the shipping crate. What were you thinking?
That I was thinking of the first time I saw it in my grandfather's house. Little did I know that the Sefer Torah, which was part of my life, would be part of that an exhibit in a museum that honors one of the great presidents of the United States. That my son Harvey said that my son Harvey is well versed in reading from the scroll of the Torah, and that he said that it's remarkable that how clear the letters were when it was unrolled and we were able to look at the scroll itself. But that I was deeply, that there it is. It was my father's gift to me, and our gift to Israel and to the United States and the President of the United States.
Right, and we in Philadelphia we actually read the Torah that morning.
Yes,
it was a Thursday morning.
Yes, we had a service and we read that. I didn't read from it, but others read from the scroll from the Torah. Yes, my son.
Right. And when you mentioned before that you opened up the New York Times and there was a photo on the front page of the New York Times of the president and Chaim Weizmann. Did you know that Torah was being given until, or that was the first time?
My father hadn't asked me about it, but he told me about it as soon as it was done, yes.
Oh, you heard about it just a few hours before.
He informed me that he had taken the liberty of giving my Torah to be taken by President Weizmann to given to President Truman. That little did I know that it would become a permanent gift.
Right. Well, in fact, you at one point, tell us a story about trying to get the Torah back.
Oh, it's a little bit long, but yes, that in the course of time, my father knew many outstanding figures in American life and in Jewish life. One of them he had met in the late 1930s was a man who, when my father met him, was a district attorney in Oakland, California. He later became better known as the Chief Justice of the United States, Earl Warren. And they had a long-standing relationship. My father would go to Washington to visit the Chief Justice and discuss matters of law with him. That my father was fairly well known and that had relationships there, so that there was a bond between them that went on for many years.
Right.
My father went to California to present Chief Justice Warren with an honorary degree on behalf of the Jewish Theological Seminary at what was then the branch of the seminary in Los Angeles.
Right. And did you at one point say to the president after he left office?
That Justice Warren was honored by the seminary also at a special Saturday in sometime in the 1960s, I think, late 1960s, that Warren came to the seminary for a weekend of study of the Talmud. And at a special luncheon on a Saturday afternoon, my father had invited Justice Warren to come to the seminary and to hear a lecture that was being given by a member of the seminary faculty named Solomon Spiegel. And Spiegel gave a lecture on Amos and Amaziah, Amos the prophet and Amaziah the king. And that that Justice Warren was there. It so happened at the same time that President Truman was in New York and meeting with a close friend of my father, Judge Simon Rifkin, who was also had been an advisor to Truman as when Truman became president. He had been an advisor to Roosevelt as well. And Simon Rifkin was a close friend of my father's and had been invited to this luncheon in honor of Justice Warren, and that having concluded his business with President Truman, said, I have to leave because I have a luncheon appointment with the seminary with Dr. Finkelstein, who's honoring Earl Warren. And that President Truman said, they're honoring Warren, I'll go to that. And that they drove up to the seminary and stunned the seminary assemblage that by walking in, that a revered justice of Supreme Court, revered justice who Simon Rifkin was, as well as the president of the United States, and that having gotten President Truman to be a guest at the seminary, my father suggested perhaps he would like to see some of the treasures that the seminary has in the rare book room. And my father gave a guided tour of the treasures in the rare book room, the manuscripts that are found there from the Geniza in Egypt. And in the course of the tour, my father said, you know, that you have a Sefer Torah. And President Truman responded, he said, yes, it's one of my most treasured gifts. And he said, well, we have a library here in the seminary, and the museum, I'm sorry, the seminary, and we would like to have that Sefer Torah on exhibit in the museum. And he said, well, I'm going to have a museum in my own, the library in Kansas City. And my father said, well, 50,000 people come a year to see the Jewish Museum. And Truman fired back, more than 100,000 are going to come to see my museum in Kansas City. And my father tried again, and he said, you're not getting the Sefer Torah. So that the seminary didn't get the Sefer Torah. But the Truman Library did. And that it meant a great deal to my father and to me that the president regarded this as a single gift of singular importance to him and to his legacy. That it wasn't a sword or anything, that other presidents get. It was a sacred text, and they revered it as a sacred text. And that I think that the library itself has done a great honor to my people and to its traditions in treating this as a special gift, not only to the President of the United States, but by the people and the state of Israel.
By the way, the Torah actually served on a ship. Is that right? A naval ship?
Yes, that there is a naval ship that bears the name of Harry S. Truman, and it has a chapel. And in that chapel, at one time, and I don't know if it's still, I gather it's not there. I think for the initial cruise of the Harry Truman, it was given to the chaplain to have as a symbol of Truman's relationship to the Torah.
We have some film of the new exhibit the Cart did for AJC a few weeks ago, or maybe a week ago. So if I can do this right.
Yeah, you got it.
So now we're in the room that is dedicated to the recognition of the state of Israel, which, as you all know, was one of Truman's very big, very important decisions. And this room is wonderful. Both it's larger than a lot of the other galleries, and it just worked out that way because it's about the midway point through the exhibit. So we put in a kind of a nice larger seating area here, partly because we have a wonderful show that is narrated by Judy Woodruff, a film that tells the story of the founding of Israel and Truman's role in that. but also because we need a place to be able to corral a bunch of third graders and sit them down and give them some instructions for a scavenger hunt or something like that within the galleries. So this is kind of a resting place, if you will, kind of a midway point where people can sit down, enjoy the film. But then this room also has traditional artifacts on display, and also the story through panels and things around the side. So I think the story of Israel is really well covered here. One of the impetuses behind our doing this major renovation was there were several aspects of Truman's legacy that were maybe mentioned before, but not in any great depth. And so with that, things like the recognition of Israel, his civil rights legacy, his World War I service, and certainly the Korean War, those were all kind of underrepresented. And now I think we've remedied that with this multi-million-dollar makeover that really gives the depth and the texture to Truman's experience. And I want to just draw your attention to this case. This is a very traditional museum-type display, but it has some very important artifacts in it, including a very special Torah and menorah that were gifts to Truman from Chaim Weizmann and Ben-Gurion, respectively. He knew these leaders. I mean, they were friends of his. I wanted to just take a second and tell you about this Torah. This is maybe one of my favorite artifacts in the museum for the simple reason that there's a very personal story connected to it. When Weizmann was coming to America to go to the White House to meet the president shortly after the recognition, he desperately needed a gift to take to the president. And so he called a rabbi in New York named Louis Finkelstein. And he was the head of the seminary there. He had a collection, had a museum that he ran as part of the theological seminary there. And he said, "Can you give me something?" Weizmann's people said, "Can you give us something to give to the president?" And he said, "Well, I can't just take something out of the collection. I mean, it's not mine. I can't just, do that. That wouldn't be ethical." He said, "But I do have a Sefer Torah that was commissioned and done for my son's bar mitzvah." This boy was about 20 by that time, but when he was 13, he had been made a gift of this Torah. But it's so valuable, you don't just leave that on the coffee table. I mean, it was in the vaults where it would eventually be displayed. So he owned this, and he figured he could part with this. And so I've met the rabbi. He became a rabbi himself, this young boy. His name is Ezra Finkelstein. He was 13 years old when he got this Torah, and about 20 when it was gifted by his father to Chaim Weizmann and then to the president. And what's really remarkable about that is I asked Ezra, "When did you find out that your father was going to give your Torah to President Truman?" And he said, "When I saw the picture on the front page of the New York Times with my Torah, I knew that." And he said, "I took it as a compliment that my father knew I would be okay with that." But, I was able to go to Philadelphia to the National Museum of American Jewish History last year, just before COVID. And we loaned this Torah to the museum to display there for about 6 months. And as we took it there, at the beginning of that loan, it was the 80th anniversary celebration of Rabbi Finkelstein's bar mitzvah. He's 93 years old, sharp as a tack, lives in New York City, and just became the dearest friend over this experience. We were there, and we were able to unveil the Torah in his presence for the first time in more than 80 years, and he choked up. I mean, he teared up to be reunited with this artifact. And the story goes that some of the Jewish leaders from New York thought this would be such a nice artifact, since it had been in Truman's possession, to display at one of the many Jewish museums or at the seminary or somewhere. And they said, "Well, Mr. President, don't you think it would be wonderful if we had this to display for our people to see?" And Truman snapped back, "Don't you think it would be wonderful to have this in my library, so people who come to see my story will have this to enjoy?" In other words, Truman wasn't about to budge. He wasn't about to give the Torah back, and he loved having this. He valued these gifts. And as I said earlier on when we were in the room about his youth, Truman is such an unlikely champion of civil rights. This gallery and the adjoining gallery that talks about his incredible civil rights legacy, the first president to address the NAACP, the first president to coin and use the term civil rights. He had a sense of an oppressed people needing a champion. And for whatever reason, Harry Truman, through some moral center of his own, moved forward to become that champion. And, you know, as much as he did for people, it's really amazing to me on the subject, now shifting a little bit about civil rights, on the subject of civil rights, later in his life, they were doing an oral history interview with him, and he started reflecting on the status of African Americans in our country. And he said, you know, it wasn't until I went to the war that I realized how badly people were being treated. And of course, he came from a slave-holding family. He grew up in Missouri. He said, I just assumed that's the way things were. He said, I tried as president to do as much as I could to help improve their plight. But sometimes when I think back on these things, I wish I had done more. And I think that is just the most telling quote of almost anything that he ever said, because as much as he did, he still recognized that there was work to do. And as we see in this room, there's still work to do in the Middle East. There's still work to do domestically when it comes to race relations in our own country. And would that we had a Harry Truman to lead us through that work. This museum attempts to encapsulate whatever it was about him that made that kind of thinking possible. And is, I think, a real tribute to him. He would have been uncomfortable with this much focus on him, but it's important, I think, for us that we recognize that there was a time when such leadership existed. And it wasn't liberal or conservative or Republican or Democrat. It was just American leadership that was on display both within our country and around the world.
So, Rabbi Finkelstein, I have one more question for you based on this photo that Harvey sent me. What did your father give to Ben-Gurion as a gift?
An honorary degree.
There you go.
That there was a special ceremony in Jerusalem where the seminary presented Ben-Gurion with an honorary degree.
Well, that's fantastic.
I want you to know, Seth, that a number of years ago, I made a visit to Ben-Gurion's house in Tel Aviv. And one of the letters on the wall of his house is from my grandfather.
Wow.
A personal correspondence. So evidently they had a good relationship. Enough so that they kept it in his museum in Tel Aviv.
I think what I find so compelling about this is as you flip forward a couple of slides, you see the Torah, the scroll, and the writing on the scroll. And we all come from written tradition. The written word is very important. It's important historically, it's important religiously, it's important to how we perpetuate and move our society and our culture forward. But I think for me, what I will remember from this is it's one thing to have the law written on a parchment. It's another thing to have the law written in your heart. And I think what Ezra represents for me is someone who has done that very, very well. And I know he speaks of his father being a very learned man and being someone that he always idolized and maybe even was a little bit intimidated by in terms of his level of knowledge and understanding. But I doubt that Louis Finkelstein had the law any more securely etched in his heart than Ezra does in his.
Thank you very much for joining us this half hour. My name is Stuart Ain. Until next week, have a good one.